In this episode of Grief in Common, we mention cancer, hospice care and miscarriage, and we talk about death and dying throughout. Hello and welcome back to Grief in Common. I'm Rosie. I've been your host before. I've also been your guest. And I'm joined for a very exciting episode today with my mum, Lisa. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about our experience with grief and how they are different and similar. And my mum might also touch on the fact that I have both a brother and a sister younger than me and how raising them has changed her experience with grief also. Mum, do you want to share a little bit of your story? And everyone's heard before me talk about my experience with grief and my dad dying, but how's that different for you?
Hi Rosie, thank you for having me on your Winston's Wish podcast. I'm really thrilled to be here. So my experience of grief, I would say, started on the 29th of April 2019 at a routine checkup appointment with the consultant, the oncologist who was dealing with your dad, John, my husband. And we went to the consultant, as I said, just a routine checkup, fully expecting to just get told, yep, you're doing well, keep going with what you're doing, we'll check you up in another 6 months. And that didn't happen. And what makes me sort of stop in my tracks when I think about that is on that particular day, it was just an ordinary Monday afternoon, and I almost didn't go to the appointment because I'm a coach, I'm self-employed, and I had clients that day, and I thought, like, do you need me to go to the hospital appointment with you? And for some reason, I don't know why to this day, something inside me just said no, cancel those appointments and go to the hospital. And that appointment, it was running late by 20 minutes. By the time we got in, I was thinking, I need to get home. My son James is to get the swim lessons. I've got to make the dinner before I do that. My head was buzzing with work and home stuff. And sitting in the room with the consultant, having done a regular check-in, a few minutes after that, we were told that Dad's results were back from his latest scan and that it wasn't good. It wasn't good news. In fact, his cancer was back, and this time it wasn't curable. And for me, in that moment, was the moment my grief started. Because in that moment, I knew that the future we had planned as a family, the future we wanted, was not going to be fulfilled. And it may sound strange to people listening, well, how could your grief start then? But it's like a big wave came over me, and I just knew that life was never going to be the same ever again. And then my next thought was, how am I going to tell the children? Rosie's doing her exams. It's a bad time. And cancer doesn't really have a timetable that fits with how life operates. Cancer works to its own schedule. As one consultant said, cancer doesn't behave itself. And I just was in shock. I was consumed with all the thoughts that a mum has about the impact on my children, the impact on John, and what we were going to do next.
So you've just been to this appointment. It's shocking, like you've said, and you're in shock, and you have to come home with Dad, with your husband, and then you have to tell 3 teenagers. So can you tell me a little bit about what was going through your head and how you thought best to approach that? And maybe if you could just give the listeners some context on maybe some of the conversations that you've had with your kids surrounding cancer previous to this appointment.
So that's a good place to start, in that when John was first diagnosed with cancer back in 2017, we made a promise to you and your brother and your sister that we were always going to be 100% honest. You weren't going to hear it secondhand from anyone in the family or friends, that you were our first priority when it came to information and communication. And we had completely stayed true to that throughout the whole time between 2017 and 2019 when we got this latest news. Only this time was different. I didn't feel like I could go home and tell you that your dad was going to die. Number one, I couldn't even get my head round the news myself. And number two, we didn't know what the next steps were. So I had no information to give other than, this is terminal. And all the questions that we had, what does that mean? What is the time scale? What intervention options are there? We had none of that information. And so what we actually did was we went to a coffee shop and we sat and looked at each other and said to each other, what are we going to do? How are we going to navigate this? How are we going to manage this? We can't possibly go home and give this news without having thought it through, because we only get one chance at this. And so we decided to wait and hold off telling you and your siblings until we had more information and until you had your exams under your belt. And there were very few people in our family circle and a couple of my friends that we told, people who could support us and kind of help us through that period of time until we were able to find a moment to talk to the three of you about what was going on. And that was about a 5 to 6 week period, and it was agony, pure agony, because every day I would get up, I would look at John, and I would know, we all are going to die, I know that, but this is something completely different, the weight of it. And when I would wake up in the morning, and this might be useful for other parents listening, they might relate to it, the feeling that I had physically in my body was something unlike I'd never experienced it before. It was like a pressing weight on my chest. It was just the enormity of what I had to deal with. And I would look at you and your brother and your sister getting ready and going out to school and complaining about chores and this and that and the other thing, the normal stuff of family life. And inside my head, it's like, I just don't know how I am going to break your hearts when I tell you this news that your dad is dying.
When you eventually told us, I can admit that I don't really remember the conversation. Obviously, conversations like this that are quite heavy and basically change your whole life in one moment can be a bit blurry when you're looking back on it. So can you tell me how you decided to deliver this news to 3 children, 3 teenagers who are vastly different in personality? And maybe talk about our personality a little bit.
We made a decision that we would tell you, all 3 of you, the information at the same time so that it couldn't be misinterpreted. But you're absolutely right. You're 3 completely different humans with very different personalities. I think you'd agree you're very extroverted. It's all verbal with you. You say what you think, sometimes unfiltered, which is brilliant. But sometimes it just all comes tumbling out. Your brother is a lot more introverted, is a lot more thoughtful in terms of thinking things through and processing information. He's not one for responding immediately until he's thought things through. And then your sister was obviously much younger. For her, the emotions ran really high. But your dad and I felt it was really important that you all got the information at the same time. And so we talked about it beforehand at length and how we were going to do it. And I spoke to a cancer support worker who's a specialist in talking to teenagers. And I find that immensely helpful, just to talk through with him how the conversation might go and some of the things, the responses that might happen, and to be okay with that. And so we chose a moment after your exams were over, Rosie. That was the main deciding factor. And your dad and I talked about it, and he wanted me to share the information. I think that's really important, that we had a conversation about it beforehand. How's this going to go? What are we going to say? And then we basically sat you all down. I think it was a Friday afternoon at the end of the week of your exams, and we told you. Was it not that week?
It was just the day of my last exam. What exams were they?
AS levels?
Yeah, my AS levels. And I came home, and I think I had a party planned, or a night out of some description, age suitable, obviously. And we came in and you sat us down at the dining room, and I thought something was happening, but I didn't know what. You and Dad were standing at the end of the table, Dad maybe like 2 steps behind you, and you said it, and I think initially there was maybe a few tears, a bit of shock, and then I think we immediately turned it to humour. And then I think it's very difficult when something like that happens, because you're almost kicking yourself. Although I agree the decision that you and Dad made to wait until I had finished my exams was a good one, you do feel, how have I missed this? Because for 6 weeks we just thought Dad was fine. No one suspected that there was anything wrong with him. He was still working. He was still up and about. So that was a bit strange. But so in terms of that conversation, and realistically, that was the first time that we'd heard that Dad was going to die, and there was nothing anyone could do. And basically this was the start of our grief journey, because even before someone dies, if you're aware they're going to die, then you can start processing that.
I think what you've just described is really important. It's something that I didn't know about beforehand. This is the first significant person in my life, aside from great grandparents and grandparents, who I knew was going to die. And it's almost like you're living this double life. It's not like he's at death's door all of a sudden. It's not like it was a rapid decline. It was literally, we have this information, but the reality of what we're looking at doesn't bear any resemblance to that. But yet we have to live with this other thing going on. And it is that, we're on a countdown, and we don't know when the countdown is up, but we're on a countdown. And so I find that really difficult at times to deal with, in terms of my expectations of family life and how we would continue to function as a family, as if everything were normal when it's not, but still have all the things that you need to do day to day in a family. Like, I still had work, you all still had your activities, life goes on in the midst of all that. So my approach, and I don't know what your recollection of it is, Rosie, but my approach was very much keep the doors of communication open, try to have conversations with each of you, try to be accessible, try to equip myself about what young people need. At this time, I'm a lifelong learner. I love to learn. I kept thinking, I'm not the first person to go through this. There must be other people out there. I don't know if you remember this, but it links to your comment about the humour. And dinner times for us as a family were always great fun and lots of poking fun at each other, and mostly at Dad's expense, to be fair, and every so often at my expense. But we were having this conversation one day, and I think Holly said, "Do you think Dad'll still be around for my birthday?" And you and James turned round to her and said, "Probably not, Halls. Like, he's probably going to be dead by the time of your birthday." And it was one of those kind of jokey things. And Holly was like, "Wait, Dad's dying?" And I remember thinking, you were in the conversation, we talked about this, this. But it was almost like she hadn't accepted it yet. And in that moment, it reminded me, and thinking back on it reminds me of the importance as the parent, as the responsible adult in this situation, of making sure each child's understanding, each young person's understanding of what's happening is in line with the reality. And that was a learning that I got along the way, always checking in on each of you individually as well as the collective communication that we shared.
So you talk about that little humorous moment there with Holly, but that actually turned into a full-scale bet between the three of us at Dad's expense, because our birthdays are very close in months. So, and the bet was whose birthday would Dad make it to, which leads us to Dad's inevitable death. I'm not really sure there's another term to put that in that makes it sound any nicer than it is. He died in October, a year and a bit after. And in September, before Dad died in October, I moved to London. After much deliberation and some very difficult conversations, we decided that the best thing for me to do, regardless of Dad's terminal diagnosis, was for me to move to London. So, do you want to talk about your feelings as a parent?
I'm laughing at this because I look back on the month of September 2020 as one of the most surreal times in my life. We just hosted a party for you for getting your exam results and heading off to university. We did that in the garden in August. It had been COVID. It had been such a strange year already. It was the first time we had all been together as a family, I think. And Dad was starting to get very weak. He was determined that you were going to university in London and nothing was going to stop you. And I probably fed off that energy because my focus was whatever John wants, John is going to get. I'm going to do everything I can to make his life on earth as good as it can be for as long as I could. Rosie is interrupting me here.
Can I just interrupt?
I know what you're going to say.
Can you just tell the world about Frank for a second, please?
Okay, I'm going to tell the world about Frank. So the children and John conspired against me in the June of 2020 and showed me puppy pictures of little blue Staffordshire Bull Terriers and said that this would make Dad's last few months on earth really wonderful and he would just love a puppy. And what am I going to do as a mum and as a wife and as someone who has the softest heart? I'm going to say, yes, let's get a puppy. Even though in my heart of hearts I was just like, no, this is a disaster. I'm going to have to look after a puppy, a dying man and 3 teenagers. So, yeah, that August was all about the build up for Rosie going to university. I will say as well that she had a very specific view of what her uni room was going to look like, and that cost me £1,000 because the other thing about you when you're going through something like this is I find it really hard to say no to my children's requests because life was hard, and if they wanted something, I find it that I just went, yeah, okay, if making your room at university looks like it's out of Town and Country magazine, then we'll do it. Let's make it happen. And so Rosie had a pink and rose gold theme, I think. So we had done all the shopping, we had the goodbye party, and we had a very emotional goodbye when Rosie said goodbye to her dad in the September before we went off to university in London. And the thing about that I remember is how impaired my decision making was at the time, because I look back on it and think, I cannot believe I thought this was a good idea. But here's what I did. I booked us on the last ferry leaving Belfast, getting to Scotland in the early hours of the morning, and drove from Cairnryan to London overnight with Rosie in the car, and the car packed to the gills with all her rose gold and pink items for her room. Got Rosie settled into her room, stayed with a couple of friends, and then drove back on my own. And the reason I say it was surreal was because it was a labour of love. It was literally, we are going to make this happen for Rosie so that she is not unable to fulfill her dreams. And her dad was so committed to her being able to fulfill her dreams. But the moment that was really significant for me was, and I don't know if Rosie even knows this, but I was driving back up through England, through the Lake District, and it was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. I remember it so clearly. I phoned John to tell him all about Rosie and her new room and at university. And he just didn't sound his usual interested self. He didn't ask about any of the details. He just sounded weak and distant. And I knew in that moment that I was going home and that he was declining rapidly. I just knew that he had wanted her to get to university. He had wanted her to be settled in, and it was like something changed in that journey. And when I got back home, he was very ill, and he ended up being hospitalised actually, and that was really, really challenging, because I felt like I had two losses. I'd lost the life and soul of the party, Rosie, who had gone off to university, and John was a shadow of his former self.
I actually remember Dad being hospitalised after I'd moved to London. So I must have only been here for 3 or 4 days. Obviously hadn't made any lifelong friends at this point. And we were out on the Santander bikes, the Boris bikes, and I got a phone call from my mum telling me that Dad had been rushed to hospital in an ambulance, and I burst into tears in front of these 4 girls who had known me 3 days, 2 days, 1 day, not very long at all, which I'm sure is a very difficult thing to cope with when you're watching someone you hardly know burst into tears. One of the girls I actually I live with now, but it was a very strange experience. And then not long after that, about 6 weeks, I flew home to visit some family and some friends with a flight booked back to London 3 days later, and I never got on the flight back because Dad had been moved into hospice care, and after 7 or 8 days in the hospice and me and Mum never leaving his side, he died. And then now you have this whole other experience where the reality you've been thinking about for the last year has now come true. So do you remember the day Dad died, Mum?
Yes, I do. I remember so much about that time in the hospice that we had together. Actually, as weird as it may sound, I really treasure that time. We had 7 days and nights together in the hospice, I think. The two of us, where we stayed overnight and we took it in shifts. Just being there with Dad, holding his hand, listening to music, just to remind the listeners, it was COVID. It was a very challenging time. The lockdown rules changed, and unfortunately, extended family and friends were not allowed into the hospice at that time. In fact, your brother and sister were only allowed in at the end, really towards the end, because of the COVID guidelines at that time. Well, not guidelines, rules, and that made for a very difficult few weeks for me as a mom, because all the time I was in the hospice, then I wasn't at home supporting your brother and sister. You were there with me. It was very intense. At times it was extremely peaceful. I think we had a 7-hour, maybe even a 10-hour Spotify playlist that we played. And I think one of the things that is really useful, and I do want to talk about, is that although I had read a lot and equipped myself for what end of life looks like, I had no real concept of how long those end times can take. And that was a huge learning for me, because I remember having a conversation with the consultant at the hospice and saying, "You've told me death is imminent, but I don't really know what that means. Like, can I pop to the loo? Can I clean my teeth?" And she explained to me that bizarrely, Dad was so fit and healthy and strong in every other way apart from his pancreatic cancer, that his body would continue to work hard to keep him alive, and that it may take a matter of days. And I think that was a relief for me to know that, and it was also a release, because I'd been scared of missing his last breath and not being there to hold his hand.
I think it doesn't really matter how much you've prepared yourself for someone to die, that when that time comes about, you're ready, because you're not really ever ready for death, especially not when it's the first significant person that you know that's died. In my case, in James and Holly's case, even in your case, that wasn't something that we had experienced before. And in the hospice, I still have quite severe noise sensitivity issues now, dripping, like things rolling along the floor, scratching. I don't know where they came from, but they're there. They trigger me and they stress me out. And then I've talked about this in a previous podcast episode, that I can't watch episodes of Gogglebox anymore, because for the 7 days that we sat in the hospice, that's all I watched. And while it was a release for me there, it is definitely not a release for me anymore. And then there is just one more thing that I want to touch on in terms of the hospice. If you are fortunate enough, and I know fortunate is not always the correct word, but if you are fortunate enough to know that the person you love is going to die, then I think it's a good piece of advice to say that if you have anything you'd like to say, or if you have anything you need to hear from that person, then try and have those conversations before the person dies, and quite far in advance of them deteriorating, if at all able, if you're able. Because one thing that no one prepared me for, and is not spoken about nearly enough, in my opinion, is that the person you love and you're watching die loses all communication methods, maybe days before they actually take their last breath. And I'm really glad that, because we knew Dad was going to die, that I could have these conversations with Dad, and he wrote us letters and recorded his life story, and he sent us audio notes, so that we had these bits of Dad to remember. Because sometimes I stress about the fact that because I lost my dad so young, because he died when I was only 18, that I would forget what his voice sounded like, or I would forget parts of him that he told me or that we had spoken about, and I would never be able to get it back. But because I'm fortunate enough to have these voice notes and these recordings, then I can't ever forget what his voice sounds like. And I know that is definitely not feasible for everyone, especially if the person that you love has died unexpectedly. But for us, that's one thing that has really stood out in grieving and through grief has really helped me. So, Mum, if you could give one piece of advice to other parents or other guardians who are grieving at the same time as young people, but might not necessarily have known that the person they love was going to die, what would that be?
Well, it's a tough question. I tend not to give advice because each experience is so different, and sometimes unsolicited advice is so unhelpful because inside your head you're screaming, but you don't know my situation. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that often, as John deteriorated, I was quite urgent about having some of the conversations. So maybe we'd be sitting watching something on Netflix, something really ordinary. I would use something that came up in the programme to say, look, you know, maybe we need to have this conversation with the kids, or maybe you need to say that to the children, or, you know, what would be really good is if I could take a selfie right now because I really want to remember this moment. So I tried to do things like that. And sometimes that meant I had to really push to have the conversation. But if I said it in such a way as, John, look, this is going to help me after you go, this is going to help me with the kids, or this is going to help me with your family, or this is going to help me, then he would do it because he loved me so much. He wanted to help me. He wanted to help me beyond his death, and he wanted me to live life, and he wanted me to be able to continue to be a good mom and a good support for the three of you. So if I put it on the line like that, he tended to think about it and either do it on the spot or eventually come round to the idea.
Taking photos and videos is one that's really helped me, and often in our family group chat you'll find pictures and videos of Dad that we just took randomly. Like, you've got a video that you really cherish, Mum, of Dad laughing. And then when I was 13 or 14, I used to take videos on Snapchat of Dad doing stupid random things that probably everyone at that time thought, what is that girl doing? Why is she videoing her dad like that? And now I look back and I think, oh, I've really captured Dad's personality there. I'm really glad I have them.
But what I find lovely about the videos that you have of Dad, they're just such father-daughter things. They're even things that when you send them through, I'm like, what is he doing? Like, what were you two talking about to get him to do that? And it's lovely because one of the things that I have found so difficult in grief is how quickly and how final death is. And I know that may sound like such a strange thing to say because of course it is final, but for me, and I know this isn't the case for everybody, but for me, when Dad died, he was so inaccessible to me. You know, I really struggled to remember his voice in my head or his smell and just his presence. It was so brutally final that day in October 2020 that when I see the videos, they make me smile. Sometimes they make me shed a tear or two. They're lovely to see because, as you say, they capture his personality. And like, Dad was grumpy sometimes. Like, he wasn't. We're not painting the past through rose-tinted spectacles here. He did have his grumpy moments, but you capture all of them and make him laugh, and that for me is just something to treasure.
Okay, so this conversation that we've had, Mum, whilst I'm sure will be very, very helpful for other people and families in similar situations that we found ourselves, has been very heavy and obviously very morbid. So I would like to end this podcast episode on maybe a brighter note. So please, can you share your favourite memory with Dad ever? So you were together since you were 14?
13.
13, so many years. So can you please share your favourite memory of Dad in that time? Pick one. And also a song which holds a memory close to your heart with Dad as well.
Oh, wow, Rosie, this is a really, really tough question.
I know, because if I asked you for 10 songs, you would also be able to give me 10 songs.
Well, it's really funny. Can I just tell you this first? So, one of the things that I did for your dad, it was about 3 years before he died. We were having this conversation about Desert Island Discs on Radio 4, and I love Desert Island Discs. I just love the idea of you have to come up with 8 discs and you tell your life story through music, because I love music and Dad loved music, although his taste in music was nowhere near as good as my taste in music, and he's not here to defend himself, so I get the win on that one. But probably it's really hard, Rosie. No, there's too many songs coming into my head here. Our wedding song, which was Benny King, Stand By Me. And probably I would go with that one simply because we had no idea when we got married in the 90s and chose a classic Benny King singing Stand By Me, just how relevant that would be to our lives together, because as I'm sure you've told the listeners, your dad was in the Royal Navy and we travelled around a lot, and sometimes I spent maybe as much as 6 months on my own when he was away at sea, and Stand By Me was definitely a song that stood us in good stead over the years, excuse the pun. My fondest memory of Dad, as you said, Rosie, we were together from we were 13. We were childhood sweethearts, and when we were first dating in our teenage years, it was we argued a lot, and there was lots of slamming of doors and me storming off and that sort of thing. That's a fond memory. But in later years, it's probably when we I know what you're trying to get me to say here. She's trying to get me to say when you were born. That is probably a really good one to go with. Was a really special time. Number one, and I don't mind saying this, I had a miscarriage before I had you, and that was another experience of loss, a very different experience of loss. So when I fell pregnant with you, it just felt like a miracle. You came into the world bright-eyed, and even the midwife commented, Rosie, I've never seen a child as alert as this one. And we gave you the name Rosie. Roses are my favourite flowers. And Dad also always sent me roses when he went to sea. So that's kind of a beautiful moment. And we were like young parents, delighted and over the moon that you came into the world.
And can I just clarify here for the end of the podcast very quickly that although it sounds like of the 3 children that Mum has had, I am her favourite. I would just like to make it very clear, and me and my sister do both know this, that James, my brother, is Mum's favourite, even though she'll claim she doesn't have favourites. And I would just like to say thank you so much for coming and being my guest on Grief in Common. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, even though we do speak most days, because even though I live in London, I still can't do anything without my mummy. Thank you for speaking to me and being very open about your experience. I know it is not an easy thing to do, and I'm sure you'll help a lot of other parents on this journey too.
Well, thank you very much, Rosie, for having me on, and I really hope that the conversation we've had is helpful to people, and also that it provides some hope that here we are 4 years later, trying our best to live life and embrace what we have, and we have a beautiful relationship, and I'm really thankful for that. And if I could just say to the listeners that I'm very, very proud that Rosie is going to be graduating this July, and if I could have thought that we would get here in that September when I dropped her off and knowing what was coming down the line, I couldn't have envisaged it, and she has done exceptionally well, and I'm really beyond proud, and I know her dad would just be thrilled to bits, and I'm sorry for her that he can't be there, but I'm going to go all out to celebrate with her, because it's really important to celebrate these very significant milestones, maybe even more so when you've been through something like we've been through.
Thank you, Mum.
You're welcome.
This podcast is brought to you by Talk Grief, powered by Winston's Wish, the UK's first children and young people's bereavement charity.
Listen to young people from different backgrounds have honest conversations about their grief and experiences.
You might hear us laugh, cry, and everything in between.
We hope that these conversations give you the confidence to talk about your own grief.
If you're grieving and over the age of 13, this podcast is suitable for you, and we hope it helps you feel less alone.
From teenagers to young adults, students to young professionals, we're all different, but we've all got grief in common. Thank you.